The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. We have a special recording for our listeners today featuring clips from a mock audit. Data integrity is a timely and well-discussed topic in the pharmaceutical industry. Regulatory agencies demand it, the pharma companies aim to provide it, and the patient depends upon it. And it is everyone's responsibility. Although it may seem straightforward, there are many factors impeding the zero findings review. Preparing for and going through audit reviews is a highly requested topic at IVT. We were lucky enough to capture this mock audit at a recent IVT conference. That discussion is featured in today's podcast and being facilitated by Alyce Deegan, Vice President of Data Integrity at Compliance Path LLC. So without further ado, here we go.
Has anyone in the last 6 months to a year gone through a lab inspection where these pesky little regulators are very trained on navigating through systems? Okay. You have? Perfect. So just think about it, no pressure, but so Abhishek doesn't hate me for life, could I have you later come up and be the data owner of the lab? Because it would be good to get your perspective and say, well, they didn't ask me that. They asked me this. Does that sound fair? Sounds good. Okay, good. Okay. Well, thanks. And I counted up, you've probably seen about 200 slides so far at this time of the day. So I'm not going to show many slides. They're here for you guys. It's going to talk about, what's the hot items? What are the regulations? It's going to tell you what are the warning letters? How fast are they going up? And then it's going to kind of hit on the major buckets. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we're doing this role play. But know if we have some time or if you guys have any questions, we'll go back. Because we got hit on a lot of these. I was just telling Abhishek, we had a global policy that said you couldn't download data on a USB drive, right? And so what's the first thing the inspectors come in? They go, I want this data on a USB drive. And we're like, well, we have a policy where we have to put in a request to ServiceNow and get an exception. They go right there and then, you're refusing to give us information. So we didn't have it in our inspection policy that we could just pop in a USB and give it to them and had it unlocked. So they're getting really, I've kind of been around the field a long time, and the people actually are going into the system, the regulators, and they're very, very savvy. So I'll just kind of give you guys tips what they're hitting us on. This is both from mock audit and real audits. Another one, everyone's spreadsheets, right? And I'm going to show you a bunch of audit findings at the end on there. One pretty famous one in cell therapy. I'm not naming names of companies because I don't want to get sued, but it is public information. And so those are the buckets. I'm not really going to go, we'll kind of hit it on there. So I'm just going to begin. And it's the afternoon. You guys have seen a lot of tattoos. I'm going to kind of pause, and I feel so bad because I just told them at lunch. So I'm going to pause, but I want you guys to stop and say, why would they ask that? Or why would they do that? And I'll kind of give you some background, and please speak up because it's a new way of auditing. Do you feel that from your, it's kind of like, I feel we're not training our lab people and our IT people to handle it sometimes. And I'll give you examples where the IT person, it did a really good job, but wasn't understanding these terms of data integrity. So, hi, welcome. I'm your inspector, blah, blah, blah.
Welcome.
Blah, blah, blah. First of all, I want to make sure we have someone who has, pretend I'm in front of a piece of equipment too here. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that I have someone with full access to the entire system, the software, the workstation. And then I want to make sure I have someone that's more of an operator role, a data that would produce data and do that. That's what they're going to want. They're going to want two people sometimes standing by with different access because they're going to challenge that. Just so you know, they're not being nice to you. They're really going to challenge it. Well, they're nice. I shouldn't say that. Okay. So the first thing they're going to say is, what's your role on this piece of equipment?
I'm the IT admin on this system.
Okay, so you're the administrator. Yeah. What what kind of qualifications do you have that have made you the administrator for this piece of equipment, and how have you been trained?
So I have the educational background, then I was trained on the SOPs that is required for the system for me to become an admin.
Okay. And now I pull the SOP and I pull his training record and I pull his CB, right? Usually. Or I put in a request on Auditopia. You guys probably use Auditopia. In your thing, we put in a request to get those 3 pieces of documents, and then the thing would go on. Then I'd say, do you have any sort of interest in the data produced by this machine? In this software?
No, I'm just an administrator.
Stop right there.
Okay.
Perfect answer back. Most IT would say that. You do have an interest. And the good thing to say is, I'm the data steward, which means I control the backups, the restores, the archiving. I also control access. And I also review the access, and here's my blah, blah, blah admin procedure. It's really hard for IT people, and I've been in IT, quality, validation, you name it, regulatory at one time. But it's really hard for IT people because they're like, I don't have interest in the data. I don't own that data in the lab. But just try to get your IT people to say, yes, I do have interest. I'm a data steward. And that's really defined in these guidances, and it should really be defined in your policy. Who's the data owner? Who's the data steward, and really give descriptions of what they do. And then also, what's the data governance over it? Does that kind of make sense? They're kind of new terms, but they're not really new terms. In the old days, it was called system owner, business process owner. So just whatever your company does, just make sure IT answers, I do have a role in the data. I'm responsible for backing up and restoring, archiving per my retention policies, and also controlling access. Does that make sense to you guys?
I have a quick question.
Sure, please.
What if IT isn't the person who is the admin on our computer on our instrumentation software?
Perfect question. And that's a lot of times in smaller companies or labs that are self-sufficient. Someone has to have that role. And if they have that role, they should not be producing data, right? Just draw that line, because sometimes it is someone in QC that never produces data, but has that system admin role, and just call them a steward.
Okay. It's generally in ours, it's generally the quality engineer department.
Perfect. And that will happen a lot, because a lot of times there isn't an IT department, helping that. Yeah. Just make sure they're doing the backup and restores.
IT or those people?
Whoever's doing those people, if they're controlling access, draw the line, give them a role, but make sure who's ever doing that backup and restore, that's described too, because that's going to get pulled in a lot. Great question. And you guys, please just pop questions like they asked me this or they did this. So the next one is, they're going to actually have you log in, the administrator. And this is where we've really tried to train people, whether it's quality engineering, whoever. And I'm not sure if they had you do this in your last audit, but they're going to have you log in under your access. And then the fun begins, right? They're going to eat. And some of them actually want to log in themselves to do it. And we try to dissuade that, because we say, well, you could affect our production data. We don't feel comfortable, because we have workflows in there, so try to do that. But I've heard auditors saying I'm logging in, and which is weird, right? Because now you've wrecked my audit trail.
But in my company, you have to have training requirements.
Exactly. So there's some weird training going on we're like, how do you have a username? We're on LDAP and, this, and then they go back and forth. And some aren't fully trained about the LDAP authentication, an Active Directory. We're all network. And then you're like, well, we can have you log into a training instance. And so it gets messy. We only had one auditor that was wild. And we were like, no. And so finally they said, okay, you log in. What they're going to do is they're going to go through their list, and I'll go through some of the lists too. And I'll tell you a horror story about a recycle bin too. It's just like bad. So they'll say, okay, show me where you do the access, right? I want to look at what your roles are, what kind of access they have. They're going to look at Audit Trail settings. A lot of times we had old equipment, to be honest with you. And we said, this piece of software only gives us this in the Audit Trail, right? And June, right? It starts and they go, okay, where's your procedure that because the software is not doing the audit trail, how are you checking the audit trail? How often do you check the audit trail? And then I got a question that I kind of was like shocked. When's the last time you talked to the software vendor to tell them you have a requirement to put that audit trail in? And then I made up, kind of didn't make it up, but I said, as part of our supplier qualification, we and we know that the software couldn't do it when we chose it, and we're on the board to add new functionality. So just know that they expect you, if that software is not providing you an audit trail that meets the regulation, that you're doing something to get off that software or upgrade that software to make it compliant. Because in the old days, we could get away with saying we have procedural controls, right? And that was like your get out of jail card, right? Not anymore. They're like, oh, that's good. But what have you done to collaborate with that software vendor to get these audit trails in? Does that make sense, you guys? Okay. And then, they're going to go with that. And then they're going to say, hey, we got asked this too, so the software doesn't provide audit trails. Where's your risk assessment on that piece of software not providing an audit trail, and how you would catch up front someone doing something to that data? So just know a lot of them are going to say, where'd you do a risk assessment that it doesn't have audit trails, and what are you going to do? And this is a thing they're going to ask you to do several things, and this is more they're going to bring in a different role. When you say the admin has all the role, or whether it's quality engineering or whatever, they're going to look and make sure. But what they really start to test the delete and the edit is when you bring in an operator, right? And you say that operator does not have the ability to do that. And lo and behold, I've sat there before where we opened up the role and it did have the ability to delete, and then they pulled the validation and, we had an old piece of stuff. So just know they're going to pull in deep. They're not going to look at the validation package right away. They're going to look at the system. And then if they find anything quirky and you have a validation package that tested it and passed it or something, hold on tight, because then the whole validation work stream is going to get pulled. And you know what the big thing is, what I've really noticed, in the old days, we could prep people in the war room. I've sat in many war rooms where before someone went in there from the lab, you'd coach them and you'd prep them and, hey, they're asking about this. Here's the procedure. Now you can't do that because the person's live right in front of the system. And I really feel like we're not doing a good enough job on the IT side or quality engineering side, training people, or even the operators, because the operators are very good at their process job. But when people start pinging on them and saying, what do you consider your raw data? What do you consider your source data? What do you consider your metadata? Their eyes are like, what's going on here? Just know that I really think we need to train people much more time with this whole data integrity. I mean, I feel I have many audit findings to prove my philosophy on stuff. So, and I'm going to annoy you with these transition slides. Okay, let me see if I went too far.
Yeah, in recent audits also, like periodic review of the audit trails, it also became very important.
Yep. They'll say, when's the last time and what triggers it? And then they also say, well, what kind of notification system are you using to do that? Because no one's going to remember, oh, I have to review that audit trail. So we kind of wrapped it into our periodic review of validation, and things like that, whenever that came up, or qualification of your equipment, put that in there too. So I'm going to continue on. Again, stop me if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense or you guys haven't experienced. So again, the inspector, like I said, they're going to have you do this. They're kind of savvy on doing it both on the Windows. They're going to have delete data, both on the operating system and within the software. They're pretty savvy at going either flipping back in the OS and the software. So just know, usually you want both those people in there. And if the operator gets confused, switch it right away. Because if they start saying, well, let's go into the OS operating system, Windows, and do it, don't torture the operator to do that. Get your quality engineering or IT person in there, because it's not fair to have an operator navigating the operating system, right? Because they're probably not trained to do that. Oh my God, recycle bin. This used a lot of my life, the recycle bin. So what happened in a past life is we didn't have good global policies on Windows on these workstations. And so we weren't hiding the recycle bin. At one company quite a few years ago, or not really quite a few years ago, but a little bit, we'd log in and it would be roaming profiles. So it would follow that operator around. So in one inspection, they always hit the recycle bin, open up the recycle bin, full of data, right? Because it followed that operator from whatever SOP revision was in the recycle bin and a bunch of files. And they were like, how do we know this isn't data? How do we know this wasn't rerun and making data? And then we're like, oh my God, here we go. So we had to do a whole recycle bin protocol because we had all these recycle bins with roaming profiles. So all this data was in them. And then we did a global policy and hid the recycle bin and also trained people, do not delete data. So they love the recycle bin is my go. So make sure you know who can put stuff in that recycle bin and they're not doing it if you can see it. The best thing is to have a Microsoft global policy and hide that recycle bin and not allow people to delete data. So it took 4 weeks to clean up because we had hundreds of pieces of equipment, these roaming profiles, and we had to write a protocol to make sure no one deleted data, real data. That wasn't fun. It was kind of like, we even had shirts made with recycle bins on. It was crazy. It was like what's that little guy on Sesame Street? We had him on there, the guy in the garbage bin. This is one, I've only had one inspector and it was strange, but I was like, oh God, I started sweating in the back of my neck. But they were like looking in the printer for failed print jobs. They were looking in the printer queue. And I said, wow, this is wild. So I'm just giving you guys anything that's happened to me just to be aware of it. You don't need to go to the extreme, but just know they're looking around everything. Obviously, temp folders, they're looking at those. Go ahead.
So even if I have a failed job in the printer, that doesn't prove anything.
No, but they'll open it up and make sure, did you not need this data? What is this data? And it's failed. So explain to me why it's sitting here, especially they'll look at the date and they'll say, why is it sitting here? Did you rerun the data? Is this your first run of the data? So anything they find, you have to talk through how that wasn't, that wasn't stability data. That wasn't, you just have to explain it away. Absolutely. You're right. Because how do you know failed printer? There's nothing in it, but they just look to find, I hate to call it orphan data, but they just love finding orphan data out there. They're like, okay, especially recycle bins failed. That's temp files. They're going to run it, find stuff in the temp files and say, what is this data? Because what they're really looking at, and they're not doing it to, be crazy. They're just making sure that you're not trying to rerun tests to get the results you want, right? That's really what you're proving. Like you run the test, here's the data. I'm not keep rerunning and hiding the data, right? So that's why they're kind of little investigators looking for that orphan data. Way more than they used to. Way more. This is a whole new game. And they're trained. They're trained pretty good on it. Now, some you won't have, right? It all depends when they're doing that. Here's another one, and I have some audit findings that I'll show you, and I do want you guys, there's this guy on LinkedIn, and I want to give him credit because every day he has a new data integrity audit finding, so I don't have to go search. His name is John English on LinkedIn, and I told him I was going to give his name, and he said it was okay. He posts all warning letters, 483s. He kind of does your work a little for you. Because, sometimes when you're in a company, people are not really listening to you. They're like, whatever, no one's looking at the recycle bin. And then you say, well, here's an audit and no one's looking at a trash bin. And I have an audit finding where they did go in the trash bin and did find stability records. And it's a whole big 483. So they are going to look in trash cans wherever they find them. And I would say out of the auditors, 50% are nosing around in physical trash cans too. They'll walk by them. And you've experienced this too. And another thing that, this was interesting to me. Be careful what's on your whiteboards outside your lab. They'll do that too. They'll start to poke because I was at a manufacturing plant. So of course we have a gazillion whiteboards where we have our stand-ups, every 15 minutes, all this manufacturing QC data. So make sure you can explain all that or anything. So don't be, train your people. Whatever you put up on that whiteboard can be pulled through. So that's just one there too. Screens not logged out of. Everyone does this, right, in the labs. And this is a behavior thing. In past lives, we tried to change behavior by every time we found out someone didn't log out, we put a little card on their screen and kept track. It help? It helped a little, right? So just kind of think about the behavior of locking out, right? And you don't want to punish people, but you definitely want to make them aware by just dropping a card. And we gave cards to everyone. It wasn't just quality or IT doing it. It was every department, just drop a card. You didn't log out, right? And now it's going to take 15 minutes to log you out, right? Time. So just anything you can do to change that behavior, because that's an easy hit, right? And then forms on desks. We had one auditor that was kind of belligerent about it. I mean, he was going through someone's, they had these stacking things and they were going through, but just know if you have any sort of data capture forms on the desk, make sure you have a story, make sure those forms are controlled, make sure that they're not blank forms, just, that kind of stuff. So any questions on that? I'm going to keep going if you guys don't. No. Okay. Data. This has been hard to do because a lot of in our labs, we haven't defined data a lot. We haven't said, this is our raw data, this is our source data, this is our metadata. So it's really hard, and nor did we have it really defined in any of the requirements. A big thing, too, they're asking for is data maps, right? Show me your data map through this piece of equipment. We didn't do that before when we validated, and so that's kind of one of our remediation, how we're going back. Now, how detailed does the data map have to be? Well, that's all about where your risk is, right? Your end to end. And sometimes at the end of the data map, you're actually recording on paper. You're going through your system and then recording. So just make sure that somewhere someone knows the way that data flows through that system. And I'd be curious, did they ask for data maps through your software?
They did not.
Okay. So just make sure, some way can explain it, or if you do it. A lot of times you can pop a data map right on the back of operation procedure, or you can pop it on anything, so it's not like huge, but just know, because what gets scary is when the operator has to do it by memory, sometimes like the data comes here, we do this, because they'll say, well, what happens here? So I think it's a good thing. It's not that hard to do, really. I mean, if you know someone who knows the process, just get someone good with Visio, sit down and data map it, especially on your high risk systems. I would highly suggest it. Where's the data saved? Everyone better be able to ask that. Oh, we run it to the network. Okay, then what happens up on the network drive? What happens there? So on that map, show, hey, the equipment talks to the network. If it's not up on the network, New Genesis, or if it goes to LIMS, just make sure where everything's going, that whole life cycle of the data. And also, what's the security as the data moves through that life cycle? Make sure someone can talk through that. Audit trails. It's really hard because you have to define what is important to us on the audit trail, right? You have to say, okay, if anyone deletes it, anyone changes it, right? Things like that. And so just be clear, because they're going to ask you, well, when you review audit trails, what are you reviewing, right? So you have to be real clear what's happening in those audit trails. Where does the data end up? And this is your data map. Do you print it out? Because unfortunately, a lot of labs, it's electronic. We print it out, and then we take that printout, and I'm probably talking, and then we re-enter. I mean, I hope I'm not talking. You guys have been there, right? You're doing some of that, right? I hope you're laughing. But it goes electronic to paper, then back to electronic to do the C of A, or you know what I mean? So and it's okay, but just make sure you can explain that in your data map and you have control over it. How's the data reviewed? And obviously if you say, if you do have interfaces with LIMS or anything like that, they're going to pull those interfaces and see how you validated them, right? Any questions on that? Data.
I have a question.
Sure.
On the Audit Trail review, companies usually have like a procedure within the periodic review or like...
Yeah. And it's interesting. IT is going to have a different Audit Trail review than the business, because IT is going to be doing Audit Trail review on access, gaining access. And if, a lot of times they'll say, okay, what if a system administrator or someone with that privilege leaves? What's your process around that? And then you have to talk through, well, they can never get access because they're cut out of the network, all that stuff. But IT will a lot of times have a way different audit trail review than the business, because we're looking at different stuff. Now you can bunch it all into one, but it's kind of confusing because you have different roles reviewing the audit trail. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So we recently, actually, incidentally, we just approved ours this morning. So for past 3 months, I authored that SOP from kind of quality and business point of view, what they need to review in the audit trail review. So, and we had number of observations because all these clients, they are getting audited by the regulators and they are asking for that type of SOP from us. So we had to come up with one. So we just did.
Yeah.
And regarding observations, there was one incident that I remember before I forget. I'll share. So we have a QMS system, and generally we do not allow the passwords to be saved for those GXP applications. So what happened? We moved one of our on-prem to AWS. So that policy somehow did not work on that application, and people were able to save remember their password on the system. And there was auditor, and he asked the person to log in. So they just selected the username. Password was already filled in. There was observation right then.
Against the policy.
So this is minor things. When we are moving from one environment to another, the small things that we have.
No, I think it's important because Okta, I don't know how many of you use Okta tiles. So to access regulated systems. So a lot of times when you're pulling it up in front of a regulator, they can pull through. They're going to say, okay, I want to see the qualification of Okta and how you're controlling, caching of passwords and things like that. Some of them will, because we had MES and LIMS and, highly regulated systems getting access through there. So they were kind of like, okay, just like you said, let's pull this through and let's do this. So that's a good one.
So we have a global policy on our systems. None of the passwords are saved, not even Gmail.
Yeah.
So every time you have to enter.
Yeah.
So we had a little bit flexible. So non-GXP systems could save. GXP ones could not. But this one fell through the cracks.
Yeah. And then when you moved it to AWS, right? Good. That's a good one. So you guys will have access to this. And I'll go through some of the findings and then I'll go back up to first of all, I think we're okay. I mean, I would like your perception or your perspective if I did they ask anything else from a business owner? We'll go through some of the findings.
So basically when they did the audit of our lab, and it was actually a client, it wasn't a regulatory.
Oh, okay.
Client audit.
Okay.
They wanted to see, because they're getting very concerned with data integrity as well.
Yep.
But they had the analysts there go through their profile and what they could and couldn't do and make sure that they had the right privileges, and then they went back to their training to make sure that they had the right level of training to do what they were supposed to do. Yep. It was all it was short, but at the same time, it was something that I hadn't experienced.
Yeah, it's new. I mean, seriously, and the regulators it's great that you're getting a taste of it because the regulators are really trained up for it. So it's kind of, it kind of can throw you for a spin because they're going so deep and they're looking at temp files and all this. So yeah, it's just some won't. But, it's just kind of in the back of your head. If they ask this, what are we going to answer? So here's some, and again, these are credit of John English. I mean, I could have searched them. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Who else? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Is the data integrity audit or inspection, that's the total focus of the visit, or is that part of a larger?
Part of a larger.
Part of a larger.
Yep, larger. And that's a good question because it's part of a larger, because it's not just the labs. They're going to, they pulled our data integrity on our big enterprise systems like MES, LIMS, all of them and stuff like that.
It's all focused on data.
Data. Well, no, it's part of the big inspection, like a PAI, POI. Data integrity is being pulled as part of the big inspection. Yeah. I know. It's the first time. I've always used PAI, but now a lot of people are doing PLI for the licensing. Yep.
I just wanted to say, it wasn't me personally, but the FDA did come into our company in 2018, and they had one inspector dedicated for data integrity.
Yeah.
Is it?
And I wasn't in the lab personally watching him, but from what I've heard and him, he was very savvy in going through. He knew exactly what he was looking for, where he needs to go.
Yeah.
And we had some observations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different type. I think it's good for the industry. I really do. I mean, it's just going to be a hump. I kind of wish there weren't 7 guidelines that we have to synchronize on. We have WHO, we have MHRA, we have FDA, we have PICS, we have them all. So there's 7 guidelines on data integrity, which is a lot to digest because they don't sync. They're kind of synced, but they're not. So as an industry, we almost have to do a mapping document, right? Because when you're writing your policies and doing your procedures, you want to check it all off. So you almost have to do a crosswalk. That's what I did and said, okay, this guideline says here's how we cover it, or else you're all over the place, right? So yeah, it's interesting. Well, this one, if there's any, and stop me with questions. John English does these all the time. I try to pull some 2018, 2019. There's a lot more out there. But this is kind of an interesting one. This is that trash can thing, right? So we went by and you can see they saw some torn stability study data in a trash. And then, it all goes downhill out of there because they were OOS, right? Their results are OOS. They even got worse, right? So then they were trying to explain that away. And then they found that they're kind of pre-signing their quality unit data sheets before the data's on them. I mean, so that's not a good deal, right? And so this just got bad and bad because first of all, then there's no trust, right? Because you've thrown stuff away that went OOS, but then your stability said you were in spec on here. And then you're having your QC or your quality unit pre-sign blank forms. You don't think this stuff happens until you start to read about it. I mean, that's what's shocking. And I always think it's not people's intention. I also think it's just aren't trained. They don't know. I don't think there's very, very few people out there intentionally doing anything fraudulent. This is all naivete. That's my belief, being in the industry a long time. Here's another one. This is kind of the access thing. Where you're just letting everyone have system admin access. Your executives, your software vendors, everyone's having access. They can change stuff. This is going to be an easy one for anyone to find, right? Because they're going to open it up. But this is an example. They're just opening up, finding everyone can do something, especially that software service provider. We struggled with this a little bit because they have to come in sometimes and do service on software. So they have to have a certain access, right? But you better be solid how you disable it, grant it, disable it, grant it, disable it, grant it. So just make sure, or else you'll have residual access because they were in there upgrading or doing something. So just make sure you have that. So that's that one. Okay, spreadsheets. Honestly, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd have people just dedicated to spreadsheets in the industry because this is early on. You guys probably recognize this. It was in the media quite a bit. Very expensive cell therapy drug. I'll just say that. Again, spreadsheets and the calculations, right? Way early on in development, right? With the mouse records. So if you weren't validating your spreadsheet for the calculation, then where was QA checking that calculation, right? So this is huge. This got caught. Now we don't trust that data in your tox study. You know how it goes. Just pull that through. But just know, we really struggle with people. Like, we did spreadsheet assessments and there was always a pushback. You don't need to go crazy on these spreadsheet validations, especially early on, but my gosh, validate that calculation, right? And if you're not, then have QA look at and do the calculation to make sure it's there. But it's really hard to go back up that development life cycle and now go retrospectively validating the spreadsheets that you produce data for your BLA or whatever and show that the data is good. It's one of those pillar processes that I always tell people to get in place. There's like 10 pillars, and that spreadsheet validation assessment is one of them. This is crazy to me. So they ran out of memory. And so they ran out of it. So they couldn't be doing this data. And then it took them forever to order some hard drives, which you can just run down the street and buy. And then 73 days, it was crazy. Then they closed the deviation 100 days after the PC. So they're losing data the whole time they're ordering data, a hard drive, which we can get a hard drive in 1 hour. So this is wild. And then they said, hey, you guys are against your validation policy too, because you're saying you do all this backup and restore and it's getting backed up or you're getting notified. Well, it proves you're not. And then when you know you're losing data, you take your time getting a hard drive. Someone got in trouble, I'm sure, for that. So I'm going to go up to the presentation real quick, and I'll just show you the beginning of it. I just didn't want to kill you guys with all these slides on the thing. But this will be up on the site. Any questions as I'm monitoring through here? Okay, the thing I think about data integrity the most, it's been around forever, even when we had paper records, but now it's really becoming complicated. The way our business models, I was just in cell therapy for a couple of years, and that is really complicated because every batch record is a patient, and a batch record is close to 1,000 pages, and it's electronic, and every QC test inside of that lab is a patient. So cell therapy is almost like a hospital because it's patient by patient by patient. So that's where that data really gets looked at heavily, right? Because when we were making big batches, you're going to catch it, right? When you're doing vein to vein and you're releasing cells before all your QC tests are coming back because you have to, because that patient has this much time, right? That data is going to be like vein to vein perfect, right? And we want that as a patient. I think this is complicating. I think how we're doing business with each other and passing data globally, site to site, and making sure nothing happens to it. I think that's a big thing, but it's definitely a global problem. I mentioned this before. I only mentioned 2 guidelines in here, but WHO just came out with a new one in October of this year. So all these guidelines are coming out, and I wish the industry would just pick one at least and harmonize them, because it's really causing heartache with us all. This is going to go up and up, right? This is all the data integrity warning letters. Here's the thing that's going on. I think this is going to go up until we get our handle on it. And then these are the buckets, kind of, it's talking nothing really big here. There's that refuse to data. I told you about the USB or whatever kind of thing if you're not given the data. A backup and restore. Don't just think they're going to ask for your backup and restore. They're going to ask for your retention and archival. So I've even been asked, so we were archiving some data on tapes, Fujitsu tapes. Then I got asked to pull the specification for how long those tapes don't deteriorate. So make sure you can pull it all the way through. If you say, hey, our retention is whatever, 20 years, here's our media we're putting it on. Now you have to prove that media, nothing's going to degrade on that media, whatever you choose, right? So just know that whole backup and restore are one thing, but make sure you get that archival or retention and archival. And also they'll a lot of times ask, when you're doing your backup, they always ask this, and it fails, obviously you talk, we get notified. But next question out of their mouth a lot of time is, what happens to the data? If it's en route to whatever, New Genesis or wherever, that's an easy one. But if it's en route to your file share, how do you know, where'd you lose it? What's your backup plan? So just kind of walk that through wherever you guys are doing that. The rest of these, you can see everyone's struggling with permissions and access, is up there. Overriding results, nothing really new on here. Spreadsheets are always going to be our bane of existence. And back, this whole thing, filling out forms before the data's in, that's probably a great idea. But there's many, if you need them for your own companies, there's many 483s and warning letters out there for data integrity to show whoever, you want. You can pull all of these and kind of bucket them up and show what's happening. And I would predict with all these guidances coming out, we're going to see, unfortunately, a lot more till we all get up to speed. So is that give you guys a little bit of a nugget for the mock audit? Any questions, or if you want to role play anymore? It's 3:30. It's like 4:00, probably not. But yeah, so good. Yeah, good luck out there. I'm just kidding. No, good. So that's all I have, you guys. Just wanted to give you a little kind of appetizer of data integrity. But good. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you to our mock audit facilitator, Alyce Deegan, our producer, Ed Sullivan, and Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, and of course you, our listener. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends and colleagues. You can help us grow in 2020. You can find out more by visiting ivtnetwork.com or by emailing customer service at ivtnetwork.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week here on Voices in Validation.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.